Okay, welcome. In this video, I will be discussing the academic and social emotional needs of gifted students. Gifted students are often hidden in plain sight in our schools. We often think that students who are doing well academically don't need our extra attention, and don't we know that there are many who aren't doing well who cry out for it? I hope to show you in this presentation why that belief can be problematic and to give you some concrete strategies to address the needs of gifted students. I felt like over the course of my education and that of my sons that teachers and parents knew essentially nothing about how to address the needs of GT students. Failing to understand and meet the needs of these students can have lifelong consequences for them. Okay, we're going to be talking about social and emotional needs and academic needs of gifted students. The social and emotional needs that we're going to discuss include overexcitabilities, peer relationships, and motivation. And academic needs are going to be we're going to be discussing creativity, acceleration, depth, and complexity. Okay, Dabrowski was a researcher who identified and coined the term overexcitabilities to describe the intense ways that gifted learners may experience the world. His theory helps to explain how different gifted learners are from average learners. They experience life more intensely, and therefore they experience the world differently. Okay, the first overexcitability that we're going to talk about is psychomotor. Have you ever seen the student that is just appearing to be driven like the Energizer Bunny? They experience the world intensely in a physical way. So we need to provide opportunities for them to move during lessons. We need to provide fidgets or seating that allows their bodies to wiggle and move. And we need to give them high interest projects whenever possible. Sit and get is not good strategy for these learners. The sensually intense student is one who smells, hears, tastes everything to the extreme. It's difficult for people who don't have these intensities to understand when these students say that something is especially offensive to them, like an odor, or who seem to hear every little thing and it distracts them from their work. So we need to be aware of the sensitivities and removing things like offensive smells when possible, or covering lights to help to reduce the glares that might exist in the rooms, maybe removing tags from clothing, or maybe even giving them things that they can use to channel their sensory nature, like maybe Velcro under the desk, or some kind of a soft cloth to rub between their fingers, or a smooth stone. They can also have an intellectual intensity. This is the kid that never stops asking the questions and that can't seem to turn off the topic to move on to another topic. So they are highly ethical and moral. They have a capacity for reflective thought. They may challenge the teacher if they feel injustices are occurring. And so what we can do for that student is we can help facilitate their search for answers and use question journals. And these are just journals where a kid can write down a question that they can come back to later, so that they are doing something with that question, and we can put the research into the answer into a more proper time. Or you might just put a big sheet of chart paper on the wall, and that could be a place for students to write down their questions. The imaginational overexcitability shows itself with students that can't tell fact from fiction. They have a rich dream life, and the danger for these students is they're very visual. So if they see something negative, it's sometimes difficult to get it out of their head, so they may have trouble sleeping. So we need to teach them ways to relax. We need to establish positive pre-sleep routines, and we need to try to make sure as much as possible that we prevent them from seeing things which are upsetting. We've all had the emotionally intense student who seems to overreact to situations that don't make sense. They have strong empathy and over attachments to people, places, and things, and change is extremely bothersome for them. Helping them identify their emotions, accepting their emotions without criticism, learning to anticipate strong responses, and connecting their physical responses to their emotions are ways to help them. Okay, peer relationships can be a big issue for the gifted student. They typically have asynchronous development. So their physical development might be behind their emotional development or their intellectual development, or maybe their emotional development is behind their intellectual and physical development. So it's hard to understand these students sometimes when they do have this asynchronous development, and it causes them to be out of sync with typical children. They feel differently from other children. They can be unconventional. Their sense of humor, they may not, other students in the class may not understand or get their sense of humor. So we have to help them with ways to find their peer group. And there's 3 ways of doing that. We could group them homogeneously. So that might look like putting a cluster group of gifted students in one class to be able to differentiate for that group and to help them find peers. We could accelerate their learning. We could skip grades if that's appropriate for a child, or we could just place them, like the math student that is ahead of the math class. Perhaps they go to the next grade level for math, but they continue their placement for other subject areas. This can help them because they might be at home with older peers who do understand their more mature ways of looking at the world. And then we also can offer them mentorships with older students, people in college or career areas that they're interested in, or other gifted adults who can help them transition through these years. But what about the kid that doesn't do any work? How can he possibly be gifted? I have heard this said myself by other teachers for students who just really aren't doing the work of the class. And that could be because maybe that student falls into one of these profiles that I'm about to talk about, which the evidence of not doing any work kind of points to the fact that maybe there's a mismatch between the educational environment and what the student needs. So there's 6 types of gifted students. There's the successful student, the challenging student, the underground student, the dropout, the double labeled, and the autonomous learner. So I want to talk about a few of these in particular because they seem to be the ones that we encounter the most. So the successful student, even if they've been identified as gifted, are not necessarily on our radar, and that's because they seem to be getting it. They seem to be doing well. They're getting good grades. They're not making a fuss in the classroom. But what's happening is sometimes if we're not thinking about what they truly need, especially academically, then we are not pushing them to the limit of what they can accomplish. As a result, they become dependent on teachers and parents, and they fail to develop resiliency. So when they do eventually in college or in their career encounter areas where they are not able to succeed easily, then it really hurts them in the long run. The other type that we sometimes see would be the kid that's not doing any work, the challenging or the dropout student. They're students who aren't conforming. They might be disruptive. What happens to them is they end up potentially drug addicts or dropping out of either high school or college, and can even be characterized as the dropout says, emotionally tuning out. So perhaps that's the kid that's sleeping every day in your classroom. That's the kid that's not coming to school. That's the kid that is disengaged from the learning. It doesn't mean they're not gifted. What it's really pointing to is there's a mismatch there between what they need and what they're getting. Okay, so what are we going to do about those kids? The problem lies in motivation. There's two theories of motivation which help to explain, number one, why they might be reacting that way, and number two, how we can fix it. So the first theory of motivation is DC and Ryan's self-determination theory. That theory says that motivation is impacted in three ways: by the student having autonomy, the student feeling a sense of competence, and the student having a sense of relatedness, a feeling of belonging and fitting in. If any one of those three areas are missing, motivation suffers. In addition, there's the value model. The expectancy that you're going to reach a goal that you value is how motivation can be measured. So high expectancy times high value equals high motivation. If either of those areas are lower, then your motivation is going to be reduced. So the way that you improve motivation is you have high expectancy and high value to the extent that you possibly can. If you need to raise motivation for a student, then you will want to think about each of those two things. Strategies to develop the autonomous learner. In our model of our 6 profiles, the autonomous learner is the ideal. It's the student that is learning for learning's sake. The student is intrinsically motivated and is flourishing. So fostering autonomous learning is an important skill for teachers to develop, and there's 5 principles in that. The student needs to be actively learning. The teacher needs to be providing options and resources, offering choices. They need to be supporting learners because not every gifted and talented student knows everything. They are going to have some things that they need to have support in. Okay, so the teacher becomes more of a facilitator rather than an instructor, and students are discouraged from relying on them as the main source of knowledge, and just like the word autonomy says, they become reflective learners about their own learning. All right, so the academic needs of gifted learners, we're going to discuss differentiation, creativity, and acceleration. So with differentiation, we want to develop the curriculum to be concept-based, to be abstract, and it's research has shown that gifted students know about 50% of what is going to be taught before it's even taught to them. So the use of pre-assessments is really important so that you can see what students already know and develop ways to allow them to progress into deeper learning over the things that you're teaching them. There is a revised Bloom's taxonomy as a way of addressing curriculum for these students, and there's a link here. We also want to think about the depth and complexity of what we're teaching. We want to increase the depth of content, or even once students have mastered content that is required or expected to be mastered, perhaps there's an ancillary area of that's related to the topic or to the content that they could explore if they're interested. We want to add more complex problems once basic information is known, and giving them work that requires them to predict outcomes is a good way of improving that complexity of their learning. And the product is less important than what's learned. If they can generate a product that is authentic and real world, let them do it. That is ideal for a gifted learner. Okay, as I said, pre-assessment assessments are very important because they do come in knowing what we're about to teach. And every student deserves to learn something new when they're at school. So I know with teachers that I work with, a lot of times the belief is that pre-assessments take away time from the instruction. But I will argue that pre-assessments are vital, especially for classes where students do have cluster groups of gifted learners, but they're also important even for students to know that they have the prerequisite skills. So pre-assessments should be used. Creativity is something that is integral to gifted learners. We talk about creativity and divergent thinking, that is a category of giftedness in the Kentucky state regulations. So perhaps a student doesn't necessarily score at the minimum level for admission into the gifted program, but they might be a divergent thinker. We actually do have creativity screeners where we can assess a student's place on a spectrum of creativity, and they could qualify for giftedness because of that creativity that they exhibit. So creativity is something that we really need to look at when we're thinking about giftedness and identification. There's actually different levels of creativity called the 4 C's that where you can kind of place a child's creativity on that spectrum of the 4 C's and determine if they're eligible for gifted services. Strategies to enhance creativity is we want to foster their creative attitudes. So a lot of our math work now is delivered in a problem-based curriculum. That actually fosters creativity because it gives multiple entry points to solving a problem. So creating that divergent thinking is facilitated when we give them the opportunity to show multiple solutions or responses to a problem and accept the novelty of ideas. So just giving them some raw materials and asking them to do something with raw materials to solve a problem or analyze how they approach using those materials, that can be really important to encouraging creativity. Okay, so what about this idea of acceleration? What is acceleration? It's allowing students to progress through an educational program at a faster rate than typical. We saw that back when we had one-room schoolhouses where all grades were taught. Students were able to move in their learning at their own individual pace and were not limited as we are today in a structure that is grade-based and age-based. AP programs are a form of acceleration. Algebra 1 students in the 8th grade are a form of acceleration. Early entrance to kindergarten is another example. But many people believe the myth that acceleration harms kids. The facts are that it actually produces significant academic gains and small to moderate gains in the social emotional needs of students. So thinking back to finding that peer group, that's one way of addressing a mismatch between a student and their age-based peer group. It's true that few students regret accelerating, and they have higher rates of productivity, work in more prestigious occupations, and earn more money. Okay, so we have a video here. I'm not going to play it because it's about 10 minutes long, but if you're interested in watching the video, I highly recommend that you do so. This is a 2E, a twice exceptional student who did early exit from high school and early entrance to college. She found out when she did that she actually had attention deficit disorder. So she talks about learning about having that diagnosis and how she dealt with it, and she talks about what it was like for her as an early exit student, an accelerated student. So it's very interesting to watch. So I just want to close with saying that it's not enough to have a good mind. The main thing is to use it well. And I want to point out to everyone watching this video that much like our pets depend upon us to feed them, to walk them, to take them out, these students depend on us to be the gatekeeper of their educational life and their professional attainment ultimately. It really is up to us to educate ourselves on what they need and find the ways to deliver that to them. So it really does have consequences throughout life. And so what we do matters. So thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I encourage you to learn more about gifted students and advocate for them in your school.